3,000 years ago, a mysterious people flourished in ancient Italy. They were rich, elegant, sophisticated. They indulged themselves feasting and drinking fine wines, amused themselves with sports and games, and spent their money on fabulous jewelry and works of art. They were called the Etruscans. Their world seemed to be a paradise, but it was doomed. Etruscan priests predicted that their civilization would last just 1,000 years. It was true. 100 years before Christ was born, this extraordinary world vanished. What happened to this great civilization that paved the way for the mighty Roman Empire? Where are the Etruscans now? This idyllic landscape in central Italy was once the Etruscans' ancient homeland, Etruria. It was the Etruscans who drained the swamps and felled the forests, dug canals and laid roads, carving out the landscape Italians now call Tuscany. Etruscan hilltop cities once dominated this whole region. Today, there's little evidence of these Etruscan strongholds. 2,000 years of Roman and medieval building buried them. The Romans are seen as the greatest superpower of the ancient world. Yet without the Etruscans, there would have been no Rome. It was the Etruscans who set Rome on its path to glory. They marked out its boundaries. With their outstanding engineering skills, they turned it from a swampy village into a major city. When Etruria was finally swallowed up by the mighty Roman Empire, Rome absorbed Etruscan culture and claimed it as its own.
They were the first high civilization in the peninsula of Italy. They passed on to the Romans a number of aspects of their own culture, which were carried forward by the Romans all over Europe, and in many cases survive today, although they're never recognized as Etruscan.
We can point to many things that influenced our culture that come from the Etruscans, even in things like what we call Roman numerals, which are actually Etruscan numerals first, copied by the Romans from the Etruscans and then inherited by us.
We'll never know how much of ourselves really is Etruscan. The alphabet that we use, some of the words we use, some of the most important, like persona, personality, we would not have were it not for the complexity of Etruscan culture.
The lost world of the Etruscans is now seen as one of the greatest civilizations ever known, equal in importance to ancient Greece and Egypt. Their culture dawned just 3,000 years ago in central Italy. The first Etruscans lived in Bronze Age mud hut villages. They exploited Etruria's rich soils, vast forests, and fertile seas, taming the natural world around them. Armed with bronze weapons, they fought their way into domination of the entire region. The rate of their development was spectacular. Ancient authors labeled them exotic new arrivals and claimed they were foreigners from the East.
For a Greek or Roman author, the thought was, you don't look like us, you don't speak like us, you're not from around here, where did you come from?
Where the Etruscans might have come from is still a mystery.
What is important, I think, is that Etruscan culture is formed on Italian soil. It really doesn't matter where they came from originally. It's just the same as with the Romans. Roman culture is formed here, so it is Italian, even though they may have come from elsewhere.
What puzzled the ancients was that in the space of a few hundred years, the Etruscans emerged as the fastest growing economy in the Mediterranean world. But there is now no mystery about the way the Etruscans got so rich. The land beneath their feet was filled with buried treasure. In 1980, archaeologist Gianangelo Camporeale struck lucky. His discovery would show Etruscan society at the precise moment it boomed.
We started patrolling in the woods. It was a dense wood, impenetrable. And we started to see some stones there. Stones which must have been laid there because it was not just natural rock. They looked alike. Then were found more. 2, 3, 4. These stones were a wall. We searched around and we found other walls.
The professor had stumbled on the most complete Etruscan town ever found. Mysteriously abandoned and never built over, it was miraculously preserved beneath a dense forest. For 20 years, this site has given archaeologists a glimpse of a lost world. It turned out to be a large settlement, 2 grand villas surrounded by a complex of smaller houses. One villa in particular was a rich source of finds. Stone weights were found. They're part of a hand loom, probably used by the slaves of the house to spin fine wool for winter clothes. Archaeologist Stefano Giuntoli is walking down a long entrance hall leading into a room where fragments of a wine goblet imported from Greece and other evidence of fine living were dug up. This was a banqueting hall where men and women feasted and lounged. It would have been decorated with sumptuous frescoes and precious objects. The Etruscan aristocrats who lived here lived well.
In the 6th century before Christ, having a house with 6 or 7 rooms means a house of a certain importance. Where did it get that importance? From the exploitation of the mine.
This was a boom town, built around a network of precious metal mines belonging to rich Etruscan families. That's how the Etruscans got rich so quickly. It was here that the Etruscans literally dug their fortune out of the earth.
They had huge mineral deposits, the largest silver deposits in Europe, enormous copper deposits, probably tin as well, and of course iron. That wealth in raw materials, and probably other raw materials as well, manifests itself in just a huge explosion, an enormous explosion in Etruscan society around 700 and 600 BC. The cities are built then, an Etruscan elite becomes wealthier and wealthier. That wealth, in the hands of just a very few people, creates a society that would have been extraordinary indeed.
All over Etruria, mines bankrolled the economy. While Rome was still a group of villages, the Etruscans poured money into building fabulous hilltop cities. Up to 25,000 people lived and worked in these self-ruling city-states, huge populations for the ancient world.
In early Etruria, it would have been rich with well-dressed ladies attended by servants walking down paved city streets, stone architecture, bridges. They would have probably had better sanitation than their neighbors because of their engineering efforts.
It was the Etruscans' extraordinary technical skills that made their great cities possible. Like modern cities, they were laid out in grids with running water and sewage systems. Beneath present-day Orvieto, great water tanks carved out by hand 2,500 years ago are still intact. Claudio Bizzari is an expert on Etruscan hydraulic engineering.
From what we know, from the remains that we got of their works connected with engineering, especially with water, It's probably a very high rank. They were specialists from that point of view. They knew exactly how to divide the spaces. They knew exactly what they were working on.
Mining made the Etruscans rich, but their technical development drove their industrial revolution. The metal that gave them the great leap forward was iron.
With the discovery of iron, they could build tools that made intensive farming possible. For example, the plow and the axe. Therefore, more land was farmed. Trees were cut down, and land could produce more than one crop a year. They started to produce iron tools for domestic use. And there is no doubt that this all brought about an authentic cultural revolution.
Just 500 years after the Etruscans emerged, in the 6th century BC, the chieftains of those mud hut villages had become rich landowning and mining aristocrats. There was a new middle class, too, craftsmen, merchants, and traders. They lived the good life while their slaves did the hard work. The Etruscan slaves, though they were still owned by their masters, lived a good life, too.
One of the ancient Greek authors mentions, gee, some of these Etruscans are so affluent, they treat their slaves as if they were freed men. The slaves have their own homes and beautiful clothing and run businesses. So it's a different style of slavery from what we in the modern world understand.
The rich aristocratic class spent their money on art. Etruscan art remains their most remarkable legacy. Through it, we can peer back across time.
We see many different scenes that depict daily life of the Etruscans. Everything from people banqueting and dining, dancing, people listening to music or playing musical instruments, people playing games. We see lovemaking, people wearing different costumes, different kinds of clothing.
Their neighbors were jealous and scoffed at the Etruscans' vulgar display of wealth.
Certainly, the Greek competitors of the Etruscans saw them as having too much, and they level the charge of luxuria. The Etruscans pay too much attention to their own comfort and well-being.
Without their art, we would know very little about what the Etruscans thought and how they lived. There are thousands of Etruscan inscriptions, but none of their books survive. It is said that all history is written by the victors, and until now, the story of the Etruscans has been told by their enemies, the Greeks and the Romans. They said Etruscan women were casual with their sexual favors and had sex with their slaves. The Greeks accused them of human sacrifice and piracy. The Romans said that the Etruscans were deeply superstitious, obsessed with trying to predict the will of their gods. So how much of this is true?
We have to play the detective. We have to put a little piece of evidence from a Greek or Roman writer with something which is excavated. I think it is a great tragedy that we've lost Etruscan literature. No doubt, if we had some of their books, it would absolutely transform our vision of them.
Our picture of the Etruscans is made much clearer through one other surprising aspect of their culture. They were deeply religious and believed that the good life would carry on for all eternity. 60 years ago, Italian archaeologists discovered undisturbed tombs on the coast near Tarquinia. They used seismic probes and periscopes to examine underground tombs hidden for thousands of years. It was the first serious attempt to explore graves using non-invasive technology. Once inside, they were astounded. Here was the treasure trove archaeologists dream about, a time tunnel into the perfectly preserved lost world of these extraordinary people. In the underground Etruscan tombs at Tarquinia, Archaeologists found whole chambers decorated with fabulous frescoes. These fun-loving people celebrated life even in death. In vivid color, they feast, drink, dance, and make love. The Etruscans built great cities for their dead. Lined with elaborate tombs laid out in grids, with streets and squares, they mirror the cities of the living. This necropolis was built alongside the ancient city of Caesarea. Each domed family vault contains the coffins of generations of Etruscan nobility. The Etruscans believed that they owed their ancestors for their good fortune and power. Honoring them was crucial. The tombs here are miniature houses. Plaster reliefs on the walls depict every object the dead might need in the afterlife. We know from the tomb paintings that a noble funeral was a dramatic, colorful event, a kind of celebration. The Etruscans believed that death was a new beginning. Life had been good, but death was going to be even better because it would be spent in the company of the gods. It is the Etruscans' obsession with the afterlife and their preparations for it that have given us our best picture of their world.
We know almost everything that we do about the Etruscans from the objects that come from the tombs. Almost everything that you see in museums is from the aristocratic tombs.
The people were buried with quite elaborate collections of pottery and bronzes, and sometimes armor and weapons for the men.
Daily life and afterlife were very closely related. And the grave goods always include dishes for eating and things related to drinking and having feasts for eternity. Couches are provided so that they can recline and they can sleep happily, wearing fine clothes and jewelry and having emblems of their status.
No self-respecting Etruscan woman would go to meet the gods without at least one polished bronze mirror. Several thousand of these delicate objects, uniquely Etruscan, have been found in the graves.
These mirrors would have originally been shiny and reflected the face of the individual using it on one side, and then you turn it over on the other side and there is a concave surface which is decorated with engravings. Very common is a spirit of adornment whose name is Lassa. She is a particularly Etruscan figure, and there's one represented right here on this mirror, a naked female figure with wings who's carrying a perfume bottle. And she's a kind of a spirit of adornment who goes with the lady to the afterlife and is there to supply perfume for all of eternity.
Death was a state called de animalis, which meant becoming a spirit god. To the Etruscans, the ancestors were still living, but in heaven.
We get the idea that they thought of the afterlife as a quite wonderful place. It was great to go to the afterlife. These people then were worshipped as ancestors. They were thought of as gods themselves.
The Etruscans worshipped many gods, some fierce, some wise, some friendly. They shared Apollo, Hercules, and Persephone, gods of the skies, with the ancient Greeks. But the Etruscan religion itself was born in a single dramatic moment out of the bowels of the earth. The gods sent a messenger called Targes, a boy born of the earth with the face of a child and the wisdom of an elder. He sang mysterious songs that only a nobleman called Tarchon could understand. Written down, They became the Etrusca Disciplina.
The Etrusca Disciplina is the entire blueprint for the life of an individual and for the lives of cultures. That it had to do with moral teachings, with every formula and ritual that you had to perform to stay right with the gods.
These gods dominated every aspect of life, and they spoke through nature. Every animal, every tree, even the wind, carried a message from the gods. The flight of birds was especially important. How high they flew and the direction from which they came was an omen of success or disaster. Etruscan priests, teachers, and interpreters were the most powerful members of society. They taught that everything in the world was divided according to holy law. Only they could decode the messages of the gods.
An Etruscan priest, when beginning divination to read the will of the gods, he would mark cardinal points, north, south, east, west, and then observe what happened next in the sky. Whatever quadrant, sector of the sky a bird appeared in, or lightning bolt, or whatever happened, would tell him which god was in charge of that.
The gods sent their most urgent messages through thunder and lightning. A secret manual held only by the priesthood set out the meaning of electrical storms. Called the Brontoscopic Calendar, it's one of the few Etruscan texts that have survived.
It's a complete document for every day of the year. It works like a switch. If it thunders, then you look up that date in your book. Many of the messages seem to us very tedious. If it thunders today, the barley crop will do well. And a few of the others are pretty racy. On August 19th, for instance, if it thunders, the women and the slaves will get up the courage to carry out assassinations.
Etruscans wouldn't risk making any decisions without first consulting the priests to read the omens and predict what the gods might think.
They were often referred to as very superstitious. The Romans said they were the most superstitious of all people because they really were obsessed with trying to understand the will of the gods. This was a very special concern of the Etruscans, was to learn what the gods wanted, what the gods thought. Were the gods angry? What would the results be of the anger of the gods?
Ancient travelers who met the Etruscans were enthralled by their religion and awed by their priests' ability to predict the future. The Romans even employed Etruscan priests as advisors. Ritualized blood sacrifice was an essential element in a priest's repertoire. Heavenly messages were read in the entrails of freshly slaughtered animals.
The liver was considered an organ which might have the power to convey messages from the gods.
The art of prediction through interpretation of the liver was just as highly developed as the reading of the skies. Priests scrutinized livers, divining through marks or bruises the handwriting of the gods. This unique model liver was found in a priest's tomb. It was probably used to teach novice priests how to interpret the will of the gods. Boundary lines separate the spheres of each divinity to tell the priest who was speaking. Readings and predictions took place high up in Etruscan temples, which dominated the landscape, like these remains on a hilltop outside Florence.
I'm standing right at the top of the plateau here of Poggiocola. It's an artificial area about an acre and a half in size, surrounded by fortification walls. It's about 30 feet across and about twice that length. So a really, really imposing building here that could have been seen from miles all the way around.
This temple was the command center. From here, the priesthood scanned the skies, carried out sacrifices, and then translated the will of the gods into every aspect of life, large and small.
The Etruscan elite were a kind of theocracy. They were priests rulers who controlled the population through the religion. So this kind of ceremonial center is at the very heart of Etruscan power and Etruscan culture.
In times of crisis, famine, disease, or war, priests may even have demanded the ultimate sacrifice, a human life.
Human sacrifice is a possibility. There's no absolute proof yet, but Etruscan imagery, tomb imagery, is filled with blood sacrifice of prisoners and that kind of thing. Maybe human sacrifice did take place, at least occasionally.
The Greeks accused the Etruscans of being tyrants and pirates. We know from their accounts that they could be vicious warriors, slaughtering hundreds when they took captives. The Etruscans were constantly at war with their business rivals. Even so, new discoveries off the coast of Italy are proving just how they became the most desired trading partners in the entire region. The Etruscans quickly became the most powerful trading force in the Mediterranean. They had the raw materials everyone wanted, rare metals. First, they were wooed by the Phoenicians from the east. Then, the Greeks arrived.
They had the mineral deposits that the Greeks wanted, and the Greeks just came right up from the east as close as they could get to the Etruscans. The Etruscans attracted them like a magnet.
In the 8th century BC, merchants from Greece joined forces with others from the east and set up a trading post on the island of Pithecusae. It suited the tough Etruscans to keep their trading partners offshore.
The Etruscans were strong both on land and sea. They were renowned as a naval power. They prevented the Greeks ever from settling on Etruscan territory, so that says something for the military strength of the Etruscans.
It's pretty clear the Etruscans will sell to you, but they are not giving you precious land.
Metals attracted the Greeks to Pithecusae, but the trade wasn't one way. The Etruscans loved everything new and exotic.
In exchange for the natural resources of Italy, the Etruscans are receiving a wealth of food products, wine, olive oil, which they will soon learn to grow and produce themselves.
The Etruscans took to the business of growing and drinking wine in a big way. Originally a Greek idea, before long they were making better wine themselves and exporting it by the ton to France.
You could say that the Etruscans taught the French, who were then the Gauls, to drink wine.
Excavations at Latte, near Nice in southern France, have unearthed an Etruscan port with a network of warehouses, each capable of holding vast shipments of wine. Etruscan traders had the business of exporting virtual lakes of wine by sea down to a fine art. It introduced the French to a whole new way of life.
After Etruria acquired wine production, it exported not only the wine, but the types of containers and the procedures of banqueting itself to the southern area of France and through the French rivers inland to the native Celtic rulers.
Just how important the wine trade was has now come to light. A ship found off the coast of France has lain under the mud for 2,500 years. This transporter carried an astonishing 30 tons of wine. How and why this ship sank is a mystery. It might have been bad weather, but these seas were notorious for pirates, and a ship laden with cargo was easy pickings. The Etruscans came up with an ingenious solution. The safest strategy for any cargo ship was speed. Etruscan engineers designed a boat which could outrun any ship their rivals could build. Their new design revolutionized shipbuilding. It was unique.
What sets them apart from their Greek competition is a foresail. They have one giant mainsail, and all of antiquity uses a square sail, but they've added another whole mast and sail in front of that, which will enable you to sail faster and perhaps to maneuver better on deep sea.
In time, the Etruscan freighters were adopted by the Romans and set the pattern for modern sailing ships. Left behind in the race for domination of the sea trade routes, the Greeks belittled the Etruscans' expertise.
The Greeks were very much interested in explaining the Etruscans away as barbarians, as pirates, when in fact what the Etruscans were doing was exactly what the Greeks were doing.
The Etruscans and the Greeks continued to trade, whatever they said about one another. No wealthy home in Etruria was complete without the beautiful ornamental pottery made by the Greeks. In fact, so many Greek vases were found in Etruria, it was assumed they were Etruscan. The trade center on Pithecusae wasn't just dealing in exciting luxury goods. It was trading in ideas, too. One big new idea was the alphabet.
The Etruscans were among the first peoples in Italy to acquire the alphabet. They acquired it from the Greek colonists. The language itself is a separate issue. The alphabet that it is written in is what the Etruscans borrowed from the Greeks and immediately modified for sounds they could make and Greeks couldn't, and vice versa. And that's part of the legacy that they passed on to the Romans, that alphabet.
Etruscan merchants then discovered a shopping paradise in the eastern Mediterranean and the land of Assyria. Local artists were inspired and worked the new designs into their own art.
Lions don't belong in Italy, but they're avidly picked up by the Etruscans. They are consumers receiving all these goods, but overnight their own artists integrate them into a growing style of native art.
Etruscans took up artistic ideas from abroad and quickly excelled at them. Now these works of art stand as a record of Etruscan society.
These really are a kind of photographic documentation of this culture. In many ways, it helps us to understand not only their culture, but also the relationship that they had with other cultures, especially the Greek culture.
Evidence from their art shows that they embraced a lot of ideas from the Greeks. One of these was the love of physical activity, especially manly contests.
They absorbed a lot of cultural elements from the Greeks, and one of the most prominent ones was sport. We see in the tomb paintings that they had very similar sporting contests to the Greeks. They had discus throwing, javelin throwing, boxing, wrestling.
The Etruscans threw themselves into these games, some of which were merely fun. But they also went in for more violent physical competitions, pitting man against animals, then man against man. They developed the bloody ritual of gladiatorial combat and introduced it to Rome. In the East, they came across the latest in high-speed transport, the chariot. It was the Etruscans who invented the nail-biting sport of chariot racing and built a new stadium for it in Rome, the Circus Maximus. Originally intended for the nobles, in cash-rich Etruria, everyone was soon driving around in chariots.
Things that were the prerogative of a king himself in the Near East are now picked up for a broader market base. And the banquet is probably the best known of these customs, in which once the great king in the Near East would recline and be served and toast his warriors. Now every warrior in the Etruscan city expects to join in a civic banquet.
Etruscans relished banqueting, a wild and crazy idea. They invented mixed banquets, where women drank wine and reclined alongside men. This public mingling of the sexes horrified their neighbors, and it wasn't the only thing about Etruscan women that shocked the Greeks and Romans. When the ancient Greeks encountered Etruscan women, they were amazed. To their neighbors, Etruscan women were frighteningly liberated. A Greek traveler, writing in the 4th century BC, described their habits.
Etruscan women dine with any man who happens to be present. Etruscans share all their women in common. It is no shame for Etruscans to be seen having sexual experiences. They exercise naked, exposing their bodies before men. The Etruscans raise all the children that are born, not knowing who is the father of each one.
How much of this is true?
Women move freely in Etruscan society. We see them at parties, reclining with their husbands, enjoying a drink of wine and dancing and living a life which was really more liberated than that of their sisters in Rome or in Athens.
Etruscan women clearly did enjoy social life, banqueting, a favourite Etruscan pastime, just as much as the men did. And we know that some women even had their own banqueting vessels. In 2 tombs at least, there are large wine bowls which have inscriptions saying that they belonged to women.
Roman women were prevented from drinking wine under pain of death. Etruscan women drank, but did they believe in free love?
There is a reference to the Etruscans in Greek historian Theopompus. He was used to the symposium, which had only men and prostitutes, and the idea, of course, that the women reclined at banquets with their husbands seemed shocking to him. He thought of the women as prostitutes, you see.
The Greeks probably saw images of women banqueting alongside their husbands and thought there was hanky-panky going on, but there's no proof of that. That's what your enemies say about you.
There is no doubt that Etruscan women, compared with Greek and Roman women, were extraordinarily free. But that's partly because their sisters in Greece and Rome were merely a man's chattels, his property, and had no rights of their own. Etruscan women were different.
Greek women were kept very much in the rear quarters of the house to do spinning and weaving and women's things. Roman women traditionally were not allowed to take much part in public life. Women in Etruria, at least aristocratic women, had very high status. They had their own wealth. They were allowed a great deal of freedom in comparison with Greek women and Roman women.
Etruscan women were independent. They could have their own money and could even own property. Roman women didn't even have their own names.
I mean, if you were the daughter of Tullius, you were Tullia, and if there were 3 of you, you were Tullia the first, the second, and the third, whereas the Etruscan women had their own name.
The fact is that Etruscan women were not only free, they were also educated. When the silver and bronze mirrors found in women's tombs were cleaned and examined, they proved that women could read and write.
They would be inscribed, and the women, all read them. I mean, there would be no point in writing down these names of Greek mythological characters if they didn't know them. So all the aristocratic women were very literate.
Etruscan women carried their beloved engraved mirrors into the afterlife, as did Scianti, a noblewoman who lived in the 3rd century BC. Now in the British Museum, her grand-looking sarcophagus, found in its own tomb, suggests that she was very rich and very important. When her face was forensically reconstructed, it was discovered that the image on her tomb was an accurate likeness. It shows that the Etruscans were way ahead of the Romans and the Greeks. This is the first verifiable portrait from classical antiquity. But there was a strange discrepancy. Although probably at least 50 when she died, the artist flatteringly showed Scianti as a much younger woman. The artist may have known her, or could this rich lady have commissioned the effigy for her coffin years before her death? When her skeleton was laid out and x-rayed, there was another revelation that would have truly astounded the Greeks.
One of the most remarkable things about Seanti is that she was a horse rider, and this is the only piece of evidence that we have for Etruscan women riding. Now, we know that Seanti rode because of the strong muscle attachments on particular parts of her skeleton, the thighs and her lower back. She spent a good deal of her time actually riding out on horseback, not confined to the women's quarters as Greek and Roman women were.
But how far did that freedom go? What about these accusations that Etruscan women indulged in free love, had sex with slaves, and that no Etruscan child knew who its father was?
The Etruscan society was aristocratic, and the unit of society was the married couple. The couple just appears repeatedly throughout the 1,000 years of Etruscan history, right from the very beginning to the very end.
The loving effigies of husbands and wives on Etruscan coffins, embracing for eternity, speak for themselves. Imagery on tomb goods, pottery, and frescoes celebrates the couple. Is it likely that the Etruscans, who spent so much money and energy honoring their ancestors, would not have cared who fathered their children?
That is not borne out in any way by the archaeological evidence. All the people that we see commemorated with either giving an offering to the gods or on their tombs or sarcophagi will give their name as so-and-so, son of, and then they'll give the names of both parents.
So what happened to the Etruscans? A people who seemed so balanced, confident, liberated. Were they so busy pleasuring themselves that their enemies took them by surprise? Or was there a new threat? The triumphant reign of the Etruscans came to an end after 1,000 years. It's claimed that they were so obsessed with pleasure-seeking that they were blind to a rising challenge, not from abroad, but from their neighbors.
The picture of the Etruscans as the so-called lovers of life, the people who are so happy living life that they don't even notice that they're being conquered, is just absolutely simplistic. Certainly they loved life. Certainly they did have a wholly different approach to life than the Romans or the Greeks. But there's no question that they were very well organized, superb warriors, politically adept.
In the 8th century BC, at the dawn of Roman history, Etruscan priests laid out its boundaries. Astute Etruscan commercial sense established Rome as a Mediterranean center for trade and business. In the 7th century, the Etruscan Tarquin dynasty ruled Rome.
At least 2, possibly 3 of the early Roman kings are Etruscans. It's only later on that the Romans come to the fore militarily and conquer the Etruscans.
In the 5th century BC, the Romans expelled their Etruscan rulers. The Romans had embraced all things Etruscan, but now the expanding city of Rome saw them as rivals. Rome wanted the riches of Etruria for itself.
The period in which Rome recognizes that it needs, wants, and will take over Etruria comes as Rome develops a large urban population that can't grow its own food and must be fed. They begin to eye the granary lands of the interior of Etruria.
It's claimed that the end of the Etruscans was a self-fulfilling prophecy. An ancient legend foretold that the Etruscan civilization would last just 1,000 years. The prediction was eerily accurate. Did the Etruscans, being so superstitious, spook themselves and just cave in to what they thought was their destiny?
They said that sometime around the 44 BC, a comet was seen, and that marked the beginning of the last age of the Etruscans. And that's, of course, the period of Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire working its way on.
That has been used as a way to explain why at the very end, the last few hundred years, they do seem to be very, very passive. They don't seem to resist the Romans the way one might expect. They don't seem to care that they are being assimilated and conquered.
But there was nothing mystical about the collapse of the Etruscans. Ongoing trade wars with the Greeks had taken their toll. Next, armies of Gauls from France attacked Etrurian cities. Driven by famine, they flooded into Italy, hungry for food and fertile land.
The Etruscans bore the first brunt of it long before the Gauls reached Rome and occupied Rome briefly. And for many years of the end of the 5th century and into the 4th century, they had to fight off armies of Gauls.
Defending Etruria from the waves of invading Gauls exhausted the Etruscans. Then the Romans began picking off their weakened cities one by one. First was the city of Veii, closest to Rome. The secret of the Romans' success was that they were united. The Etruscans, with their independent city-states, sometimes even at war with one another, were not.
They never hang together long enough to present a united front to Rome. And so Rome picks them off. When a city is weakened by the Gauls, Rome jumps in. And that's probably the secret of why the Etruscans lost out.
Some towns held out under siege for years. Others collapsed almost without a fight. Within 2 centuries, Etruria was just another part of the swelling Roman Empire. Gradually, people stopped speaking or writing Etruscan. Everyone spoke the language of the conquerors, Latin.
People really stopped speaking Etruscan in about the 1st century BC, and it's then that we really think of the Etruscan people as coming to an end, as an entity.
When the language died out, so did the literature. Ancient writers comment on the body of rich Etruscan music and art, their poetry, plays, and stories. Only scraps have been gleaned from inscriptions. What happened to it?
There was no need or interest on the part of the Romans to carry on with the Etruscan texts, except for the religious ones. So they just disappeared.
What about the people? Many Etruscans were slaughtered, but not all of them. The aristocrats melted into Roman society, an exotic flash of color among the Roman elite. Behind the scenes, they still influenced the new empire.
What happened to the Etruscans is that many of them became Romans. The Etruscan aristocracy would move to Rome and just become a part of the Roman power elite, a lot of them.
Recent studies have analyzed the names of senators in the Roman Senate in the 1st century BC, and a lot of them were Etruscan families. If you saw the handwriting on the wall, you let Rome take nominal charge of your city, and you groomed your son to go to Rome and be a senator, and he could help the family fortunes back home by his votes in the Senate.
The archaeologists' struggle to illuminate the fabulous world of the Etruscans will never end. Though they lived thousands of years ago, they reach out to our modern world in a very direct way. Their story is compelling, their attitude to life intriguing. The spirit of the Etruscans lives on in Italy. Sometimes, when the evening sunlight catches the faces of modern-day Tuscans, we step back to Etruria, home of Italy's lost people, the Etruscans.